2 drinks and a sack of wheat. A price paid in silence. His back throbbed from 2 days in the saddle, his throat dry as dust. Yet Zane Crow didn't rush. He rode into the small border town with one purpose: to trade for a sack of wheat and a tin of salt before the first snow locked the trail tight. His ranch was small, barely enough cattle to carry him through winter, and hunger had already taken too much from him once. He swung down from the horse boots, thudding against packed earth, and tied the reins to the post. Beneath his hat, dark hair clung damp to his brow. The years had carved lines into his face that made him seem older than 34. The war had stripped away his youth, and the land had done the rest. He wasn't here for whiskey or company, just grain supplies and the long road home before dark. The Copper Spur saloon doors groaned as he pushed them open. The smell of stale smoke and spilled beer hit him like a wall. Half the room was filled low voices carrying over the scrape of boots. A poker game in the corner paused long enough to size him up before resuming. Zane headed for the counter and gave a single nod to Clint Mercer, the barkeep. "Need wheat if you got it," he said, his tone calm and level. "Only 1 sack left," Clint replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Came in with the wagon train last week. Price went up." Zane didn't argue. He reached into his coat and laid out the few silver coins he'd saved enough for wheat salt and a little coffee. It was everything he had left. Then a voice rose from a far table, loud enough for every man in the room. "Or drawled Bo Redden, you could take the girl there. 2 drinks and that sack, she's yours." The room went dead quiet. Zane turned his head. In the shadowed corner stood a young woman barefoot, her back pressed to the wall. Bronze skin, black hair falling loose across her face, a torn calico dress hanging off one shoulder. Her knees were scraped raw, a thin cut dried along her leg. She breathed fast but silent. Her eyes met Zane's, steady and defensive. His jaw set hard. He'd seen enough women traded like livestock during the war, enough ugliness for 1 lifetime. He stood there weighing what it would mean to step into this. She wasn't his problem. He barely kept himself fed some weeks, but walking away felt worse than hunger. Zane looked at the man. 2 drinks and the wheat, that's the deal." Bo grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "That's it. Pour the drinks." Zane didn't touch them. He laid the coins on the counter, took the sack of wheat, and slung it over his shoulder. Then he turned to the girl. "Let's go." His tone wasn't harsh, but it left no space for argument. She hesitated, glancing between him and Bo. When no one stopped her, she stepped forward. Zane kept a steady hand at the small of her back, not forcing, just guiding her through the silence. Chairs scraped, eyes followed, but no man spoke. Outside, the late autumn wind cut sharp across the street, making her shiver. Zane tossed the sack into the wagon bed and nodded toward it. "Climb up." She obeyed, leaving faint streaks of blood on the wood. He pulled a blanket from the back, wrapped it around her legs, and took the reins. The road out of town stretched quiet wheels, crunching over frozen dirt beneath a pale sky streaked with cloud. He didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. She sat rigid beside him, clutching the blanket, staring straight ahead. By the time his cabin appeared low between 2 cottonwoods, the sun was sinking, throwing long blue shadows across the ground. Zane pulled the wagon to a stop, climbed down, and offered his hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her palm was rough and cold, but her grip was steady. Inside the cabin smelled of dust and disuse. Zane lit kindling, quick, coaxing the flame to life, until the chill began to fade. He poured her a tin of water, set out bread, and stepped back. She ate slow, cautious, watching him, as if waiting for a trick that never came. When she was done, he spread a blanket on the bed for her and unrolled his coat on the floor near the stove. Outside, the wind rattled through the trees. Inside, the fire snapped and whispered. For the first time that day, Zane Crow felt the weight in his chest ease. She was safe, at least for tonight. And tomorrow, he'd figure out what came next. For the first time since walking out of the saloon, Zane Crow felt the weight inside his chest loosen. He'd made his choice. Taya Windrider was safe here. Tomorrow, he'd have to figure out what came next. The fire burned low through most of the night, snapping once in a while as the logs settled. Zane didn't sleep much. He lay on his coat beside the stove, one arm tucked under his head, listening to every sound the small cabin made, the wind scraping against the shutters, the groan of the timbers in the cold, and the uneven rhythm of the woman's breathing from the bed. Every so often she stirred a sharp breath, then stillness like someone haunted by bad dreams or afraid of waking in a strange place. Zane kept his eyes closed but stayed alert, ready if she bolted for the door. When dawn crept in gray through the single window, the air carried the bite of frost. Zane pushed himself up, stiff and sore, and fed the stove until the flames came alive again. Smoke and warming iron filled the room. He poured water from the bucket into a basin, setting it close to the fire to take the chill off. "You can wash," he said quietly, steady but calm. Taya opened her eyes, blinking against the pale light. For a moment, she only stared, as if deciding whether he meant kindness or some new trick. Then she drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and sat up. Zane turned away, giving her space, and stepped outside. The morning hit hard. He broke the thin crust of ice on the trough with his glove and splashed his face with water cold enough to sting him awake. When he came back in, she had already washed. The dirt was gone from her face and hands, but the bruises along her cheek and jaw stood out clearer, now shaped by a man's grip. The sight sent heat through his chest, but he kept his tone even. "There's bread," he said, nodding toward the table. She obeyed, sitting straight-backed, breaking the bread into small pieces like she was saving them for later. Zane poured himself coffee and stood near the stove, drinking in silence. When she finished eating, he set a worn blue work shirt and a needle on the table. "You sew?" he asked. Her dark eyes lifted to his, and she nodded once. "Good. Fix that if you want. Thread's in the box." He picked up her shoes, if they could be called that cracked leather, with half the soles missing, and carried them to the porch. With a strip of hide and 2 small nails flattened with his hammer, he patched them as best he could. It wasn't much, but it'd keep the rocks out until he could make her proper boots. By mid-morning she had mended the shirt, every stitch small and even. Zane studied her work and gave a short nod. "Fine job," he said, and meant it. She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed just a little. When he hauled water from the pump, she followed without being asked, carrying the bucket back steady and full. She moved quiet, but sure the way someone did who'd worked hard all her life. Inside, she swept the dirt from the floor with the old broom and scrubbed the tin plates until they gleamed in the firelight. Zane found himself watching her more than he should. She was cautious, every glance measuring him, but she wasn't fragile. That thought settled something in him. Maybe with time this could work. By sundown he cooked beans and salt pork, setting her plate first. She hesitated before sitting across from him at the small table. They ate without a word, the sound of spoons against tin filling the room. After supper, he took his rifle and stepped outside. The wind had picked up again, dragging dust low across the yard. No riders, no strangers. He went back in and slid the bolt on the door. Taya sat near the stove, knees drawn up under the blanket, eyes on the fire. For the first time since he'd brought her from that saloon, she didn't look ready to flee. "Got a name?" Zane asked, his voice softer than before. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Taya." He nodded. "Zane," he replied, though she probably already knew. The fire burned lower, the warmth soft and steady. For a long while they sat in silence. No tension, just a quiet that didn't hurt. He lay down on the floor again, close enough to feel the heat of the stove. Before closing his eyes, he saw her glance at the locked door, then back at him, as if weighing whether she could trust this place. By the time the last coals glowed red, her breathing had turned slow and even. Zane exhaled a long, tired breath, the first one all day that didn't feel trapped in his chest. She was still there, still alive, and that was enough for now. Tomorrow there'd be chores to do, fences to mend cattle, to check food to store before the snow came. But tonight the cabin didn't feel so empty. For the first time in months, Zane found himself hoping she'd still be there when morning came. Morning broke sharp and cold, the kind that made the boards creak underfoot. Zane rose before first light, same as always, pulling on his boots and feeding the fire until it roared against the chill. He looked toward the bed. She was still there, curled under the blanket, breathing slow. For a long moment, Zane Crow just stood there, taking in the quiet shape of the woman, still asleep, beneath the blanket. He hadn't been sure Taya Windrider would stay through the night. The thought eased something deep inside him. He set the coffee pot on the stove, the smell soon filling the small cabin with warmth. Then he poured hot water into the basin and placed it beside the fire. "Morning," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying no edge of command. Taya stirred, sitting up slowly. The blanket slipped down her shoulders, and her braid had half undone during sleep, a dark strand falling across her cheek. She brushed it aside, and for the first time, Zane caught the faint bruises still shadowing her wrist. He turned away, pretending to busy himself with his gear, giving her privacy, same as the day before. By the time she finished washing, the air was heavy with the scent of coffee and beans simmering low on the stove. Zane set a tin plate on the table cornbread he'd saved from the last baking. "Eat before it gets cold," he said simply. Taya nodded, moving quietly to the table. She ate with care, breaking each piece, small, wasting nothing. Zane poured her water and sat opposite, drinking his coffee. Slow, his eyes steady, but never pressing. When the meal was done, he rose and said, "Chores." He handed her a bucket and led her out to the pump this time, letting her work the handle until the water came clear and cold. She carried it back without complaint. Zane watched the way she moved, sure-footed, practiced, balanced, even on her patched shoes. She wasn't weak. After tending the stock and tossing feed for the hens, he pointed toward the woodpile. "We'll need more cut before snow." He split the first log with clean, practiced strokes. Taya gathered the pieces and stacked them neatly by the wall. They worked in rhythm, his axe striking her hands, moving until their breath showed in white clouds against the cold air. Back inside, she swept the floor, shook out the blanket, and arranged the tin plates without being told. She moved through the cabin like someone deciding to belong. Zane watched her once, then turned back to fixing the worn strap on the wagon harness. The steady scrape of her broom filled the silence. Later, when the sun climbed higher, he went out to check the north fence line. Taya followed part way, saying nothing, just watching him tighten the wire and reset a post that had shifted. When he looked up, she said simply, "I can carry," and reached for the tools. He nodded, letting her help. By afternoon, both were worn. Zane stoked the fire, hung a pot of beans, and let it simmer. The cabin turned warm, almost peaceful. For the first time since she'd come there, Taya spoke more than a few words. "You live here alone, yeah?" Zane said. "3 winters now." She nodded slowly, her eyes roaming the room. The single bed, the shelves half empty, the second chair rarely used. "Quiet place," she murmured. "That's why I like it," he replied. Something subtle passed between them. Not fear, not suspicion, but the start of understanding. When darkness came, they ate together again, the soft crackle of the fire, the only sound. Afterward, Zane rested his rifle against the wall and checked the latch on the door. "Road's clear," he muttered mostly to himself. Taya moved closer to the fire, cross-legged on the floor, palms out to the heat. Her shoulders had loosened, her eyes softer than before. She looked at him once, then back at the flames. "Thank you," she said quietly. Zane gave a single nod. It was the first time she'd thanked him for anything. That night, as he stretched out on the floor, the cabin didn't feel hollow anymore. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was calm, steady, almost kind. He closed his eyes, knowing she was still there under the same roof, and the thought didn't weigh on him. It felt right, like the missing piece he hadn't known he was searching for. Morning broke cold again, the kind that made the boards creak and breath hang in the air. Zane rose before dawn, same as always, pulling on his boots and feeding the fire until it glowed bright. He looked toward the bed. She was still there, curled beneath the blanket, breathing slow. For a moment, he just stood and watched, grateful she'd stayed. Her braid had loosened during the night, one dark strand falling across her cheek. Zane Crow gave a single nod. "Good work." Taya Windrider's eyes dropped to the mended shirt, and for just a flicker, a hint of pride softened her face, before she folded it neatly aside. After breakfast, Zane reached under the bed and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were bits of fabric and a few spools of thread supplies he'd traded for long ago but never used. "For a dress," he said, setting the calico cloth on the table. Taya hesitated, then looked down at her torn dress before touching the fabric gently. "Thank you," she murmured. The morning found Zane outside fixing a sagging gate while keeping half an eye on the cabin window. Through the glass, he could see her bent over the table, sewing with patient focus hair slipping forward until she tucked it behind her ear. By midday, she had mended the worst of the tears and brushed the dust from the skirt. It wasn't new, but it looked whole again. "You did that fast," Zane said, hanging his hat by the door. She gave a small shrug. "Feels better whole." He understood what she meant more than she likely realized. That afternoon, Zane brought in a plank and set it across 2 sawhorses. When she looked at him questioningly, he said, making another chair, "Only got one doesn't seem right." She watched him measure and plane the wood curls of shavings gathering on the floor. She moved around the room quietly, like someone slowly claiming the space as her own. Zane watched her. Once, then returned to mending the strap on the wagon harness. The sound of her broom strokes filled the cabin steady and comforting. Later, when the sun climbed higher, he went out to check the north fence line. Taya followed part way without asking, watching him tighten the wire and reset a post that had come loose. When he glanced up, she said simply, "I can carry," and reached for the tools. He let her. By late afternoon, both were worn. Zane built up the fire and set a pot of beans to simmer. The cabin filled with warmth that felt different, settled, almost peaceful. "You live here alone?" she asked at last. "Yeah," Zane replied. 3 winters now." She nodded slowly, taking in the small cabin, the plain shelves, the second chair, the single bed. "Quiet place," she said. "That's why I like it." Something shifted in her expression, small, but real. Not fear this time. Maybe understanding. When night came, they ate together again, the soft crackle of the fire, the only sound between them. After supper, Zane leaned his rifle by the wall and checked the latch. "Road's clear," he muttered to himself. Taya sat cross-legged on the floor near the stove, hands stretched toward the flames. Her shoulders no longer looked tight, her face calmer. She looked at him once, then back at the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly. Zane nodded once. It was the first time she'd ever thanked him. That night when he lay down on his coat by the stove, and she settled on the bed, the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. It just was soft, steady, and shared. He closed his eyes knowing she was still under his roof, and that thought no longer felt like a burden. It felt right. The next morning broke cold and clear frost crunching under their boots. Zane saddled the horse while Taya pulled on her mended dress and the patched shoes he'd fixed days before. Her hair was tied back in a single braid, neat and practical. As the sun rose over the cottonwoods, she stepped outside. Zane looked up and nodded toward the wagon. "We'll ride the north fence," he said. "Won't take all day if we start now." She climbed up onto the wagon bench without needing help this time, pulling a blanket over her legs, as Zane took the reins. Their breath turned white in the morning air, and for a long stretch neither spoke the rhythm of wheels and hooves filling the silence. At the fence line, Zane jumped down and tested the wire. "2 breaks," he said after a moment. "We'll patch here and down by the creek." Taya didn't wait for direction. She gathered the tools from the wagon bed and followed him, holding the wire steady as he twisted it back into place. The work went faster with 2 sets of hands, and for the first time it felt like they were building something together. When the last post was finally in place, Zane Crow wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve and glanced over at Taya Windrider. "You've done this before," he said. She gave a small nod. "My father had cattle." "Before." Her voice caught, and she stopped coiling the leftover wire instead. Zane didn't press. He just said quietly, "You're good at it," and took the coil from her hands. By midday, they were back at the cabin. Taya went straight to set water to boil, while Zane forked hay into the troughs for the cattle. When he came in, the room smelled of beans simmering and warm cornbread heating on the stove. He sat down at the table for a moment, watching her move through the space. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. It felt alive, tended, claimed. When they sat to eat, he poured her water first, then his own. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't strained anymore. It was easy. "You live here always?" she asked after a while. "Since the war," Zane said. "Bought the land cheap. Too dry, too far from town. Figured I'd make it work." Taya nodded slowly, glancing around at the small cabin, the rough-hewn shelves, the second chair, the single bed. "It works," she said simply. That afternoon they cut wood together. Zane swung the axe in steady rhythm, while Taya stacked the split logs into neat rows beside the wall. When he paused to catch his breath, she held out a dipper of water. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and she didn't pull away right away. As the sun dipped low, they carried the last of the wood inside and shut the cabin tight for the night. The fire burned bright warmth creeping into the corners of the room. Zane sat at the table mending a strap on his saddle, while Taya combed out her long hair near the stove. The strands shimmered red in the firelight, and he found himself watching her longer than he intended. When she noticed, she didn't shy away. Instead, she turned and held out the small wooden comb. "You do it," she said softly. He hesitated only a breath, then took it from her hand. Sitting behind her, he ran the comb slowly through her hair, careful not to pull too hard when he met a tangle. She sat still, shoulders relaxing little by little until the tension left her body. When he handed the comb back, she looked over her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you, Zane." "You're welcome," he said, his voice low and sincere. That night she lay on the bed and he on his coat by the stove. The wind outside moaned through the cottonwoods, but inside the fire ticked softly. The animals stirred in the corral, and Taya's breathing was slow and steady, not the quick, fearful kind from that first night. For the first time, Zane let himself think beyond tomorrow. If she stayed, there'd be enough work and enough quiet to make this life worth something again. With that thought, he fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in weeks. The storm rolled in just after dawn, a wall of gray swallowing the horizon. Zane had seen skies like that before. He knew better than to wait. He moved quick, shutting up the hens, leading Sable and her calf into the lean-to. By the time he came back inside, the wind was howling, carrying dust and bits of dried grass across the yard. "Stay close to the fire," he told Taya, pulling off his gloves. "This one's gonna hit hard." She nodded but didn't stay idle. While he stacked extra wood by the door, she hauled water from the pump, filling both buckets and setting them inside before the handle could freeze. Together, they readied the cabin, stuffing burlap into the window gaps, bringing in tools that might ice over. By the time the first flakes hit, the place was as tight as they could make it. When the storm came, it hit fast and mean. The wind slammed against the walls, rattling the single pane of glass. Snow whirled so thick outside that even the corral posts vanished. The sound filled the world, a deep, constant roar. Zane stood by the window, watching until there was nothing left to see but white. "Cattle'll hold," he muttered to himself. "They'll bunch along the fence line." Taya sat by the fire shawl, pulled tight eyes on him. "You've seen storms like this before?" she asked. He nodded. "Worse. You stay put, you'll be fine." They took turns feeding the fire through the long day. The stove glowed red, casting warm light, while the wind screamed outside. At noon, Zane brewed coffee and broke the last of the cornbread. Taya ate slow, calm now, despite the storm's rage. Late in the afternoon, a faint thud cut through the wind, the sound of a hoof striking wood. Zane was on his feet at once, shrugging into his coat. "The mare," he said sharply. "She's due to foal." "I'm coming, Taya," Windrider said quickly, already wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. Zane Crow hesitated for half a breath, then gave a sharp nod. Together they pushed out into the storm, leaning into the wind as snow cut across their faces like knives. The short walk to the lean-to felt twice as long as it should have been. The lantern Zane carried threw a weak circle of light through the white blur. Inside, Sable was restless, sweating sides, heaving her body, trembling with the effort of labor. Zane dropped to his knees in the straw, checking her with practiced calm, while Taya held the lantern steady. "She's close," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Keep that light high." The next hour passed in a tight rhythm of tension and breath. Zane worked steady, guiding life into the world, while Taya whispered low to the mare, in a tongue he didn't know, soft sounds that somehow calmed the frightened animal. When the foal finally slipped free, it lay still for a heartbeat before letting out a thin, sharp cry that cut through the roar of the storm. Taya knelt beside it, rubbing the slick body dry with a scrap of cloth. Zane made sure it was breathing right, then stepped back as the tiny creature whisper wobbled to its feet. Sable nuzzled her newborn, and for a long moment the two humans just stood there, snow melting into their hair, breath steaming in the cold air, watching life push back against the storm. "Good work," Zane said quietly. Taya looked up at him and nodded, a faint smile crossing her face, small but sure. Back at the cabin, they stripped off their wet clothes and hung them by the stove to dry. Zane poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one to her. She accepted it, fingers brushing his. "You didn't have to let me go out there," she said softly. "You earned the right," answered, sitting across from her. The storm raged through the night, but the cabin felt warmer than it ever had. They sat close to the fire long after the coffee was gone, trading short words, quiet ones, until silence felt easier than talking. When Zane finally stretched out by the stove, bone-tired but content, Taya was already curled on the bed, her face soft in the flicker of firelight. Something had shifted between them, no longer just survival. Trust had begun to take root, quiet, but certain, like spring grass pushing through the thaw. The storm broke sometime before dawn, leaving the world outside hushed and bright. When Zane opened the door, the yard lay buried under a thick white blanket. The corral posts were half hidden, and the cottonwoods glittered with ice. His breath fogged in the cold air as he stepped out, testing the snow's depth. With his boot, it came near his shin. Behind him, Taya joined him at the door, shawl drawn tight, her dark hair loose from sleep. The firelight still warmed her face. "The foal?" she asked. "Still standing," Zane said. "I'll check her after I clear a path." He grabbed the shovel and started cutting a trail to the pump shoulders, working hard against the packed snow. Taya watched for a moment, then took up the broom and began sweeping the porch clean. They moved together without a word, and by midday the yard was open again. The air was cold, but clean sunlight slicing sharp shadows across the drifts. Zane hauled water, while Taya went inside to start bread. Soon the cabin filled with the smell of rising dough and wood smoke. When Zane came back, he paused in the doorway. She stood at the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair falling forward as she kneaded the dough smooth against the board. The cabin looked different now, alive, warm, like it had finally remembered what it meant to be a home. After they ate, Zane saddled the horse and rode the fence line to see what the storm had done. Taya stayed behind, tending the fire and caring for Sable and Whisper. When he returned near dusk, she was waiting at the door, cheeks pink from heat and cold alike. "They're both strong," she said before he could ask. "The foals nursed twice." "Good," he replied, hanging his coat and stamping snow from his boots. The quiet of evening didn't last. Just as Zane sat down at the table, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats echoed down the road, sharp cutting through the stillness. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, crossing the cabin in 2 strides. Through the last light of dusk, 2 riders appeared, Bo Redden and Jed Carver, and Zane stepped out onto the porch, rifle low but ready. Evening Bo called, his grin ugly in the cold light. Evening Zane answered, voice flat as iron. "We came to talk about what you've got inside that cabin," Bo said, sliding off his horse. Jed stayed mounted, hand near his coat, where a pistol likely waited. "She's not yours to talk about," Zane said evenly. Bo smirked. "You paid too little. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. She's worth more than that. Maybe I come inside and make it square." Zane didn't move, but his eyes hardened, the silence between them turning sharp. "You made your trade," he said. "It's done. You ride home," Zane Crow said, voice even as stone. Bo Redden shifted in the saddle eyes, calculating his chances. Before he could speak, the cabin door creaked open behind Zane. Taya Windrider stepped out. Shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, standing just behind him. She didn't say a word at first, but her presence alone changed the air. She wasn't hiding. "This is my place now," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the cold. Bo's smirk faltered. Zane didn't lift his rifle, but his grip tightened on it. "You heard her?" he said. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind scraping over the snow. Then Bo spat into the white and muttered, "Fine. She's yours." He swung up into his saddle, motioned to Jed Carver, and the two of them turned their horses down the trail, their hoofprints vanishing behind a curtain of drifting snow. Zane stood on the porch a moment longer, watching until the last sound of hooves faded into the distance. Only then did he lower the rifle. His shoulders eased, but not by much. Inside, Taya went straight to the fire. Sitting close, her face lit orange by the glow. Zane hung the rifle back on its pegs and crouched beside the stove to stir the coals. The cabin was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. It felt changed, heavier somehow, but alive. "You didn't have to step outside," he said after a long pause. "Yes, I did," she answered simply. Zane looked at her, then really looked, and something passed between them, wordless and strong. They had stood side by side, and neither had flinched. They ate in silence that night, but the quiet wasn't cold anymore. When Zane rolled out his coat near the stove, he noticed Taya had left the blanket turned down on the bed, as if she'd made space for him should he want it. He didn't take it yet, but the thought stayed with him as he closed his eyes. Outside, the stars burned sharp and silver against the black sky. Inside, the fire crackled steady, and for the first time since he'd brought her out of that saloon, Zane knew she wasn't just staying because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because she wanted to. Morning came still and quiet, the kind of calm that lingers after danger has passed, but isn't forgotten. Zane was up early following the men's tracks halfway to the road before turning back. He came inside with a set jaw but a calmer heart. Calmer. Taya was already awake, seated at the table with the shawl around her shoulders, a loaf of bread cooling on a cloth beside her. "They won't be back," Zane said, hanging his coat by the door. "You're sure?" "Sure enough," he replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Word'll spread. Men like that always go sniffing for easier trouble." Her shoulders eased at that. She took the cup he handed her, and they ate in a quiet that no longer felt cautious, just steady. After breakfast, Zane pulled a strip of good leather from a trunk under his bed and laid it on the table. "Your shoes won't hold much longer," he said. "Figure I'll make you something better." Taya's brow lifted slightly, but she didn't argue. She sat close while he worked, watching his scarred hands move with surprising patience, measuring her foot, tracing its outline, cutting the leather true. When he needed the awl or thread, she handed them, without a word, her fingers steady beside his. When the first boot was done, he set it near the stove to soften, then helped her slip it on. It fit snug, covering the scars and cuts that had just begun to heal. She looked down at it, then up at him, gratitude shining in her dark eyes. "Try walking," he said. She took a few careful steps across the floor, slow at first, then sure. Better, she said, the faintest smile curving her mouth. He nodded once and started on the second boot. By afternoon, both were finished and broken in enough for the cold. They walked to the corral together, snow crunching underfoot, breath clouding in the crisp air. Whisper kicked playfully at the drifts, while Sable stood calm and steady. "She'll be strong," Taya said softly. "She will," Zane answered, standing beside her. When they went back inside, the cabin smelled of stew and wood smoke. Zane unbuttoned his coat, sitting by the fire, while Taya set out 2 bowls. Then, without a word, she came and sat beside him, closer than before. "You didn't ask me to stay that night," she said quietly. "You just let me." Zane turned toward her firelight, glinting off the edge of his jaw. "I wanted you to stay," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Still do." For a heartbeat, she studied him, measuring the truth in his eyes. Then she nodded once and leaned closer, her knee brushing his. When he reached up slow, careful to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, she didn't pull away. The silence between them stretched warm and easy before she leaned forward until their foreheads touched the fire, casting them both in gold. Zane Crow let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, then kissed Taya Windrider slow and certain, without rush or hesitation. Her hand came to rest against his chest, fingers curling into his shirt, and for that moment the storm, the men, and all the silent weeks between them faded away. When they finally drew apart, the fire still glowed bright, but the air in the cabin felt changed, warmer, alive, like something sacred had shifted. Taya stayed close beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. For the first time since she'd walked out of that saloon, she looked not just safe, but settled. They ate supper together quietly, but the silence no longer carried any question of belonging. It was the kind of quiet that felt like home. That night when Zane lay near the stove, he saw the blanket on the bed turned back again. But this time, he understood she wasn't leaving space out of courtesy. She was telling him without words that she wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time since the war, Zane caught himself hoping for days ahead instead of just surviving them. A week later, the snow began to melt. The mornings froze the ground hard, but by afternoon it turned to thick, wet ruts. Zane spent those days mending fences, hauling fresh wood, and clearing the path to the corral. Taya kept busy inside washing clothes and keeping the cabin in order, but every now and then she stepped outside to watch him work her boots, leaving neat tracks in the thawing snow. Something between them had shifted since that night by the fire. Neither said it out loud, but it was there in the way she always set his cup before her own, and the way he found himself glancing toward the cabin window whenever she was out of sight too long. One clear morning sunlight slicing through what was left of winter Zane came in from the yard, his coat slung over one shoulder. "We're riding into town," he said, voice calm, but carrying weight. "Need coffee salt, and there's something else we need to set right." Taya looked up from kneading dough. "Set right?" He nodded once. "Paperwork. I'm done letting any man think he's got a claim on you." She stood still for a heartbeat, hands resting on the dough, then untied her apron. "I'll come," she said simply. They rode into town side by side, wagon wheels creaking over frozen earth. Taya sat straighter than she had the first time she'd traveled that road, her hair neatly braided, her repaired dress clean, her new boots laced tight. Zane kept a steady pace. By the time they reached the trading post, the sun sat high, and the town was awake. No one dared say much as they passed. Their first stop was the general store. Zane bought coffee salt and a bolt of calico cloth she had admired before, but never asked for. He told Harlan Finch to wrap it, and the man did so without a word. Then they made their way to the courthouse. Inside, Eli Carter, the clerk, looked up and narrowed his eyes briefly before nodding. "Judge is in," he said, pulling out a set of papers. "Figured you might be back." Virgil Tate's office was small, the shelves lined with ledgers. He read through the papers, then looked up at Zane. "This what you want?" "Yes," Zane said firmly. The judge turned to Taya. "And you?" "Yes," she said, voice steady and clear. Virgil signed his name, pressed the seal into the paper with a sharp crack, and leaned back. "Then that's that." When they stepped outside, the sun glared bright against the melting snow. Zane untied a strip of blue ribbon from their parcel, and clumsy but earnest tied it into Taya's braid. She smiled, small, genuine, and reached up to fix the uneven knot before leaning in and kissing him quick and sure. They rode home slow, saying little, but no words were needed. The road ahead felt lighter, no weight pressing behind, no shadow of a man who might come calling. Back at the cabin, Taya went straight to the fire, stirring the stew she'd left simmering that morning. Zane hung his coat, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down at the table as she brought the bowls over. The warmth in the cabin that night wasn't just from the stove. The second chair, the mended dress, the boots by the door, all of it felt permanent now. When the meal was done, Zane reached across the table and took her hand, his rough fingers closing gently over hers. "This is your home now," he said quietly. Taya met his gaze, eyes steady. "Ours," she said. Later that night, the fire burned low, the iron ticking softly as it cooled. Zane lay on the bed this time, Taya curled against his shoulder, the blanket pulled over both of them. Outside, the last snow shimmered under the stars. No questions remained. The woman who had once stood barefoot and silent in a saloon now slept under his roof by choice. And the man who had once lived only to endure now had something to live for. When spring came, the wheat in Zane's field broke through the soil in shoots of green, and Whisper the foal in the corral ran strong beside her mother. Folks in town started calling her Mrs. Crow, and Zane never corrected them. For the first time in years, the cabin wasn't just a place to wait out the cold, it was home. And the two of them sitting side by the fire looked like they meant to stay.